"You got fat," he said, like it was funny, like it was nothing, like it didn't land on my chest and press the air out of my lungs in front of 40 people who suddenly forgot how to chew, how to talk, how to pretend they weren't listening. And I stood there frozen with a tray in my hands and a smile that cracked too slowly to hide anything at all. Because the truth was I had heard worse from him before, just never this loud, never this public, never like this, and my fingers tightened around the edge of the tray as the overhead lights blurred and the clink of silverware turned into a dull hum inside my ears. And for a second I thought I might actually drop everything, plates, glasses, myself. But I didn't. I just stood there and let it happen. Because that's what you learn to do when you've been with someone like Kyle Bennett for 2 years. You learn how to stay still, how to take it, how to disappear without moving an inch. And I almost did, almost faded into the background like I always used to, until my hand moved on its own, slow, instinctive, pressing gently against my stomach like it needed to remind me I wasn't alone in my own body anymore. And that's when something shifted, not in me, not in Kyle, but in the room, like the air had been quietly replaced with something heavier, something colder, something that made the back of my neck prickle before I even understood why. And I looked up without meaning to, past Kyle's smirk, past the faces pretending not to stare, past the polished glass and dim lighting of the restaurant, to the far corner where the VIP section sat like a separate world entirely. And that's where I saw him, or maybe felt him first, because he wasn't loud, he wasn't moving much, he wasn't doing anything obvious at all, just sitting there with one hand resting near a glass he hadn't touched in minutes, watching, not like the others, not curious, not amused, but focused, steady, like he had been tracking every second of this moment long, before it reached its peak. And something about that gaze made my chest tighten in a completely different way, sharper, more aware, like being seen instead of judged, which should have been comforting, but it wasn't, because there was nothing soft about the way he looked at me, nothing casual, nothing accidental, and I dropped my eyes too quickly, like I'd touched something I wasn't supposed to, like I had stepped into a line I couldn't see. And Kyle laughed again, louder this time, repeating himself like he needed the room to agree with him, like he needed validation. "I mean, seriously, Ava, what happened to you?" And a few uncomfortable chuckles followed, not because it was funny, but because people don't know what else to do when cruelty shows up in a tailored jacket and a confident voice. And I swallowed, forcing my lips to part, forcing something out that sounded like a response even though I didn't hear it myself. Something small, something dismissive, something that would end this faster, because that was always the goal. End it, move on, survive the moment. But then a sound cut through everything, soft but sharp enough to stop the air mid-breath, the distinct, deliberate placement of glass against wood, and I felt it more than heard it. That shift again, that invisible line moving closer, and before I could look, before I could prepare, before I could even decide whether I wanted to acknowledge it, a voice spoke, calm, low, controlled in a way that didn't need volume to command attention. "Say that again." And it wasn't directed at me, not even close, and Kyle turned, confused at first, then annoyed, like someone had interrupted a performance he thought he owned. And I followed his gaze, slower this time, because I already knew what I was going to see. The man from the corner now standing, not rushed, not aggressive, just present in a way that made space rearrange around him without anyone asking, without anyone noticing how they had shifted, stepped back, gone quiet. And he looked exactly the same as before, composed, precise. Except now there was something else under it, something darker, something that didn't flicker or fade, just settled, steady and undeniable. And Kyle scoffed, because of course he did, because he didn't understand what he was looking at, because people like him never do until it's too late. And he repeated it, slower this time, louder, like he was proving a point. "I said she got fat." And the moment the words left his mouth, the room changed completely, not louder, not chaotic, just silent in a way that felt intentional, like something had been decided without anyone voting on it. And I felt my pulse in my throat, my hand still resting against my stomach, my body caught between two worlds, the one I knew, where I endured and stayed small, and this one, where something bigger was unfolding without my permission. And the man stepped closer, just one step. But it was enough to make Kyle hesitate, just enough to crack that confidence for a fraction of a second. And then his eyes shifted, not to me, not to the room, but to my hand, still pressed gently against my stomach, and everything about his expression changed in a way I couldn't fully understand. Not softer, not kinder, just certain, like he had just confirmed something he had suspected all along. And when he spoke again, it was quieter, but somehow it reached deeper, past the noise, past the fear, straight into the part of me that had been trying to stay hidden all night. You shouldn't speak about things you don't understand, he said, not to me, not gently, but not cruelly either, just final. And I didn't breathe, didn't move, didn't think, because the way he looked at me now wasn't about the moment anymore. It wasn't about Kyle or the room or the humiliation still lingering in the air. It was about something else entirely, something I hadn't said out loud, something I hadn't even fully accepted myself yet. And he took another step, close. Enough now that I could see the exact shade of his eyes, dark, steady, impossible to read, and yet somehow already knowing more about me than I was ready to admit. And when he spoke this time, it wasn't for the room, it wasn't for Kyle, it was just for me, low enough that no one else could hear it, but clear enough that it settled into my bones before I could question it. You're not alone. And my heart stuttered. Because that wasn't possible, because he couldn't know that, because no one knew that. And yet the way he said it didn't sound like a guess, didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a fact I hadn't been brave enough to say myself. And for the first time since Kyle's voice cut through the room, I felt something shift inside me too. Not fear, not shame, but something dangerously close to being seen. And I didn't know yet that this moment, this exact second where everything tilted just slightly out of place, was the beginning of something I wouldn't be able to walk away from, no matter how hard I tried. You are not alone, he said, and the words did not feel like comfort. They felt like a line being drawn around me, invisible but real, like something had just changed ownership without my permission, and I did not know whether to step back or lean into it. So I did neither. I just stood there with my breath caught somewhere between fear and something I could not name, and Kyle laughed again, but it sounded different now. Thinner, uncertain, like he could feel it too. That shift, that quiet, weight pressing down on the room. Look, man, this is none of your business, he said, trying to reclaim something he had already lost, and the man in front of me did not raise his voice, did not step closer, did not need to, because everything about him already said enough. It became my business the moment you decided to speak about her, he replied, calm, steady, final, and the way he said her made my chest tighten, not because it was possessive, but because it sounded certain, like he had already decided where I stood, and I had not been asked. And Kyle scoffed, shaking his head, glancing around like he expected someone to back him up, but no one did. Not a single person moved, not a single voice rose to support him, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked small, not physically, but in a way that came from being out of place in a room that no longer belonged to him. And I should have said something, should have stepped in, should have ended it the way I always did, with a quiet apology and a quick exit. But I could not, because the man standing in front of me had not taken his eyes off me since he moved. Not once, not even when Kyle spoke. And it felt like he was waiting, not for Kyle, but for me, for something I had not yet realized I needed to say, and my hand pressed slightly firmer against my stomach without thinking. And that was when his gaze dropped again, just for a second, just enough to notice, just enough to confirm something that made his expression change in the smallest, most dangerous way. Not anger, not surprise, just certainty becoming something solid. And he exhaled slowly, like a decision had just been finalized. And then he turned his attention back to Kyle. You should leave, he said, and it was not a threat, not a warning, just a statement that did not allow for alternatives. And Kyle opened his mouth to argue, to push back, to reclaim the control he thought he still had. But the words did not come out the same way they usually did. They stumbled, caught, lost whatever sharp edge they had started with. And he looked around again, searching for something, anything. But all he found was silence. And then he laughed again, but it was forced, hollow. Yeah, whatever, he muttered, stepping back, adjusting his jacket like that could restore his dignity, like walking away was his choice and not something that had just been decided for him. And he turned, leaving faster than he wanted to, slower than he should have. and the door closed behind him with a soft click that felt louder than anything he had said all night. And just like that, the room exhaled, the sound returning slowly, conversations picking back up in careful fragments, silverware clinking again. But nothing felt the same, not to me, not after that. And I realized I was still standing there, still frozen in place, still caught in a moment that had not fully ended yet, because he had not moved, not away from me, not back to his table. He was still there, still watching, still too close for this to be something I could ignore, and I swallowed, finally forcing myself to speak. "You did not have to do that," I said, my voice quieter than I intended, and he tilted his head slightly, like the word surprised him, like the idea that he had a choice in the matter had not even occurred to him. "Yes," he said simply. "I did." And the way he said it made it clear that to him. There had never been another option, and that should have unsettled me more than it did, but instead it made something inside me loosen just a little, something that had been tight for a long time, something that recognized the difference between control and protection even if I was not ready to admit it yet. And I shook my head slightly, trying to ground myself, trying to pull back into something familiar. "You do not even know me," I added, because that felt like the only solid argument I had left, and he almost smiled, not fully, just enough to shift the corner of his mouth in a way that felt deliberate, measured. "I know enough," he replied, and my chest tightened again, because that was not possible, because no one knew anything about me beyond what I showed them, beyond what I allowed. And yet the way he said it made it sound like he had been watching longer than tonight, like this was not the first moment he had noticed me. And before I could ask, before I could question that, he stepped closer, just enough to close the space between us in a way that made the rest of the room disappear. Again, and his voice dropped, softer now, but no less certain. "You should not be here," he said, and I frowned, confused, defensive. "I work here," I replied quickly, because that was the truth, because this place was one of the few things I still had control over. And he shook his head once, slow, deliberate. "That is not what I meant," he said, and his eyes flicked again, briefly, to my stomach, and this time I followed his gaze, my breath catching as the meaning settled in deeper than before, heavier, more real, and my hand moved again, instinctively, protectively, and when I looked back up at him, something in my expression must have changed, because his gaze softened just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it, enough to understand that whatever this was, it was not random, it was not coincidence. It was something that had been set in motion long before I walked into this shift tonight. And I shook my head again, quieter this time, more to myself than to him. "You are wrong," I whispered, because that was easier than accepting the alternative, and he held my gaze, steady, unyielding. "No," he said, just as quietly, "I am not." And for a moment, neither of us moved, neither of us spoke, the space between us filled with something that felt like the edge of a truth I was not ready to step into. And then he reached into his jacket, slow, deliberate, pulling out a card and placing it gently on the edge of my tray, not forcing it into my hand, not pushing, just leaving it there like an option I could choose or ignore. And his fingers brushed the surface for a second longer than necessary, like he was marking the moment, and then he stepped back, just one step, but it was enough to give me space to breathe again, to think again, to realize that the world had not stopped, that people were still moving around us, still talking, still pretending this had been just another moment in a normal night. And he looked at me one last time, that same steady, unreadable gaze, and said, "Call me when you are ready to stop pretending you are alone." And then he turned, walking back toward the VIP section with the same quiet authority he had arrived with, leaving me standing there with a tray in my hands, a card I had not touched, and a truth I was no longer sure I could ignore. The card sat on my tray like it weighed more than everything else I was carrying, heavier than the plates, heavier than the expectations, heavier than the version of my life I had been trying to hold together for months, and I did not touch it, not right away, because touching it would make it real, would make him real in a way that was harder to ignore, and I was not ready for that, not yet. So I turned, moving through the restaurant on autopilot, placing orders, clearing tables, nodding when spoken to, but none of it felt the same anymore, like I had stepped half an inch out of my own life and could not quite step back in. and every time I passed the VIP section I felt it again. That quiet awareness, like I was being watched, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made it impossible to forget that he was there, that this had happened, that something had shifted and could not be undone. And I told myself it did not matter that he was just another customer, that this was just another night. But my hand kept brushing the edge of the tray where the card rested, like it was checking to see if it was still there, like it expected it to disappear if I stopped paying attention. And when my shift finally ended, when the lights dimmed slightly and the last tables cleared out, I found myself standing in the back hallway staring down at it, my name tag slightly crooked, my feet aching, my whole body tired in that deep, familiar way that used to make everything else easier to ignore, but not tonight. Tonight it did nothing, and I exhaled slowly, picking up the card before I could talk myself out of it, turning it over between my fingers, feeling the weight of the paper, the texture, the simplicity of it. No unnecessary details, just a name and a number, Adrian Russo, and something in my chest tightened at the sight of it. Because names like that did not belong in my world. They belonged in headlines, in stories people whispered about but never confirmed, in places I had learned to avoid without ever being told to. And I should have thrown it away right then, should have dropped it in the trash and walked out like none of this had happened. But I did not. I slipped it into my pocket instead, and that small decision felt louder than anything Kyle had said earlier, louder than the silence that followed, louder than the way Adrian had looked at me like he already knew something I was still trying to deny. And I pushed open the back door, stepping out into the cool night air, the city quieter now, the hum of traffic softer, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. And for a second I just stood there, breathing, letting the night settle around me, letting the distance from the restaurant create the illusion that I could leave everything that happened inside behind. But it followed me, of course it did, because it was not the place that had changed, it was me, or maybe it was the way I saw everything now. And I started walking, my apartment only a few blocks away, my steps slow, measured, like I was trying to delay something I could not name, and I almost made it to the corner before I noticed the car, black, parked just far enough from the entrance to not be obvious, but close enough that it did not feel accidental. And I told myself it meant nothing, that it was just another car on another street. But then the door opened, smooth, quiet, and I stopped without meaning to, my breath catching as he stepped out, the streetlight catching the sharp lines of his face, the same calm presence, the same controlled stillness that made everything else feel louder by comparison. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the distance between us filled with everything that had already been said without words. And then he took a step closer, not rushing, not imposing, just closing the space like it was inevitable, like this conversation had been waiting for the right moment. "You did not call," he said, and I blinked, caught off guard by the statement, by the assumption, by the fact that he expected me to. "I just got off work," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt, and he nodded slightly, like that answer fit into something he had already considered. "And yet you kept the card," he said, and my hand moved instinctively toward my pocket, like he had seen through the fabric, like he knew exactly where it was, and I frowned, defensive now. "That does not mean anything," I said quickly, but even as I said it, I knew it was not entirely true, because if it meant nothing, I would not have kept it, and his gaze softened just enough to acknowledge that. "It means you are thinking," he said, and I shook my head, stepping back half a step, trying to reclaim some space, some control. "You do not know what I am thinking," I said, and this time he did smile, faint, controlled, like he appreciated the challenge more than he should have. "No," he admitted, "but I know what you are not doing," and I hesitated, the words settling heavier than they should have. "What is that?" I asked, and he held my gaze, steady, unyielding. "You are not walking away," he said, and my chest tightened, because he was right, because I was still standing there, still listening, still engaging in a conversation I could have ended the moment he stepped out of that car, and I exhaled slowly, looking away. For a second, grounding myself in the familiar, the cracked pavement, the distant sound of a passing car, anything that was not him, anything that made this feel normal again. "You helped me back there," I said finally, quieter now, more honest than before. "But that does not give you the right to follow me." And his expression did not change, did not harden, did not retreat. It just remained steady, like he had expected that too. "I am not following you," he said, and I let out a short, disbelieving breath, glancing at the car, then back at him. "You just happened to be here," I replied, and he tilted his head slightly, considering. "I made sure I was here," he corrected, and that should have unsettled me more than it did, but instead it made something inside me shift again. That same unfamiliar recognition that had started in the restaurant, that sense that this was not random, not accidental, not something I could easily dismiss, and I shook my head, softer this time, more uncertain. "Why?" I asked, and this time there was no hesitation, no calculation, just a simple, direct answer. "Because you should not be alone right now," he said, and my hand moved again, instinctively, protectively, resting against my stomach as the words settled deeper than before, and when I looked back up at him, really looked this time, I realized something that made my breath catch in a completely different way, something I had been avoiding since the moment he first spoke to me, something that felt too big, too dangerous to acknowledge, but impossible to ignore any longer. He was not guessing. He was not assuming. He was certain, and for the first time since this night began, I was not sure what scared me more, the fact that he knew, or the fact that part of me was starting to believe him. "You think you know," I said, but it came out softer than I intended, like the words did not fully belong to me anymore, like they had already been weakened by the way he was looking at me, steady, certain, impossible to ignore, and he did not answer right away, did not rush to correct me, did not need to, because the silence between us was already saying more than anything I could argue against, and I shifted my weight. Slightly, the cool night air brushing against my skin, grounding me just enough to keep standing where I was instead of stepping closer or turning away completely, and my hand stayed where it had been, resting lightly against my stomach, not hiding it anymore, not pretending it was not there, because pretending felt pointless now, felt fragile in a way it had not before, and I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to meet his gaze again. "You are making assumptions," I added, stronger this time, trying to reclaim something, anything. But he shook his head once, slow, deliberate. "No," he said, and there was something in his tone that settled deep, something that did not leave room for doubt even if I wanted it to. "I am recognizing patterns," he continued, and I frowned, confusion mixing with the unease already building in my chest. "Patterns," I repeated, and he nodded slightly, like he had expected the question, like he had already prepared the answer. "You left the table before finishing your shift rotation," he said calmly. "You stopped eating during your break 2 weeks ago, and you have been avoiding coffee since then." And my breath caught, sharp and sudden, because those were not things someone could guess, not things someone could observe in a single night, and my mind raced, trying to find an explanation that made sense, something ordinary, something safe, but nothing came, and I took a small step back without realizing it, the distance between us widening just enough to remind me that I still had a choice, that I could still walk away if I wanted to. But I did not, because part of me needed to hear the rest, needed to understand how far this went. "You have been watching me," I said, and this time it was not a question, and he did not deny it, did not soften it, did not try to make it sound like something less than it was. "I have been aware of you," he corrected, and somehow that felt more honest, more unsettling, because it did not pretend to be harmless. And I swallowed, my pulse quickening in a way that had nothing to do with fear alone, something sharper, more complicated. "Why?" I asked again, and this time there was a slight pause before he answered, not hesitation, just consideration, like he was deciding how much to say, how much I was ready to hear. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, but no less certain. "Because 3 weeks ago, you walked out of a hospital on 34th Street at 9:42 in the morning, and you did not go back in," he said, and my heart stopped, not metaphorically, not gently, but completely, because that was not something anyone knew, not something I had told anyone, not something that existed outside of me in that moment, and my fingers curled slightly against my palm. As I stared at him, the memory crashing back in pieces I had been trying to keep buried, the sterile smell of the hallway, the quiet voice of the nurse, the words I had not been ready to hear, but could not unhear, and I shook my head instinctively, like that could push it away, like that could make his words less real. "You do not know what happened there," I said quickly, but my voice betrayed me. Thinner now, less controlled. And he stepped closer again. Just one step, just enough to close the distance I had created, not forcing, not cornering, just steady, inevitable. You are right, he said. And for a second I thought he would leave it at that he would let me hold on to that small piece of denial. But then he continued, and the words landed heavier than anything he had said before. I do not know what they told you, he said quietly, but I know what you did after. And I froze. Because I knew exactly what he meant, because I had replayed it in my head too many times to count. The way I had walked out into the sunlight, the way the world had kept moving like nothing had changed, the way I had stood there for a full 5 minutes without knowing where to go, what to do, who to tell, and then I had chosen silence, chosen to carry it alone, because that felt safer than letting anyone else see how uncertain I was, and my eyes dropped for a second, just long enough to break the connection between us, just long enough to breathe, and when I looked back up, he was still there, still watching, still waiting, but there was something different now, something that felt less like control and more like understanding, and that confused me more than anything else, because I did not know how to respond to that, did not know how to place it in the version of him I had already started to build in my head. You should not know any of this, I said finally, and it sounded weak even to me, like a protest that had already lost its strength, and he did not argue, did not dismiss it. He just nodded slightly. No, he agreed. But I do. And the simplicity of that answer made my chest tighten again, because it meant there was no easy explanation, no comfortable answer that would let me walk away and pretend this was normal, and the silence stretched between us again, heavier this time, filled with everything I was starting to understand but had not yet accepted, and I felt it then, clear, undeniable, the shift inside me that had been building since the restaurant, since the moment he first spoke. Since the moment my hand moved to my stomach without thinking, the realization that this was not just about him. Knowing, it was about him being right, and that terrified me more than anything else, because if he was right, then everything I had been telling myself for the past 3 weeks, every attempt to minimize it, to ignore it, to pretend it would go away on its own, was already falling apart, and I shook my head slowly, not in denial this time, but in something closer to disbelief. You cannot just show up and tell me what my life is, I said, quieter now, more honest, and he stepped back slightly, giving me space, giving me room to breathe, and for the first time since this conversation started, his voice softened, not weaker, not uncertain, just measured. I am not telling you what your life is, he said. I am telling you that you do not have to face it alone. And my throat tightened, because that was the one thing I had been trying not to admit, the one thing I had avoided even in my own thoughts, and I looked away again, toward the empty street, toward anything that was not him. Not this moment, not the weight of what was being said, and I realized then that walking away was still an option, that I could turn, take the last few steps to my apartment, lock the door, and pretend none of this had happened. But the truth was I already knew I would not, because something had changed in a way that could not be undone. Something that had started the moment he said those first words to Kyle, something that had only grown stronger with every sentence since. And when I looked back at him, really looked, I saw it clearly for the first time, not just certainty, not just control, but intention, and that was what made my breath catch. Again, because it meant this was not chance, not coincidence, not a moment that would fade by morning. It meant he had chosen to step into my life, and the question was no longer why, it was what came next. What comes next is not something you get to control, he said, and the words settled into the space between us like they had weight, like they were not meant to threaten but to prepare, and I felt my chest tighten at that, not because of the tone, but because of the truth underneath it, the part of me that already knew things were shifting beyond what I could manage alone, and I crossed my arms instinctively, not to block him, but to hold myself together, to create some kind of boundary in a moment where everything felt like it was slipping past the lines I had drawn. You keep talking like you are already part of this, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, and he did not look offended, did not look surprised, just certain. I am, he replied simply, and that answer landed harder than anything else, because it did not try to convince me. It did not ask for permission, it just existed, and I shook my head, a small movement, but it carried everything I was still trying to hold onto. You do not get to decide that, I said. And this time there was a flicker in his expression, not anger, not impatience, something closer to restraint, like he was choosing his next words carefully. "You are right," he said, and I blinked, caught off guard again, because that was not what I expected, not from someone who spoke with that kind of certainty, and for a second I thought I had misunderstood him. But then he continued, quieter now, more deliberate. "I do not decide for you," he added, "but I do not ignore what is mine either." And my breath caught at that, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he said them, not possessive in the way Kyle used to say things, not controlling, not demanding, but protective in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling, and my hand moved again, resting against my stomach, slower this time, more aware, like I was finally acknowledging what had been there all along, and I looked down. For a moment, just long enough to feel it, that quiet presence, that reality I had been trying to keep at a distance. And when I looked back up, he was watching me, not with intensity this time, but with something steadier, something that felt like patience. And that confused me more than anything else, because patience was not something I associated with men who carried that kind of presence, that kind of quiet authority. And I swallowed, trying to find my footing again. "You still have not answered my question," I said, softer now, less defensive, because the argument I had started with was already shifting into something else, something I could not fully define. "Why me?" I added, and this time he did not answer right away. He did not rush, did not fill the silence. He just looked at me, really looked, like he was deciding how much truth I was ready for. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured. "Because 3 months ago, you walked into a charity event on Madison Avenue wearing a blue dress that did not quite fit the way you wanted it to," he said, and my heart skipped, because that memory hit me unexpectedly. The crowded room, the unfamiliar faces, the way I had felt out of place but determined to stay, and I stared at him, confusion mixing with something sharper. "You were there," I said, and he nodded slightly. "I was," he confirmed, and the world seemed to tilt just slightly again, because that night had not meant anything to me beyond a temporary escape, a chance to feel like I belonged somewhere else for a few hours, and yet to him, it clearly meant more. "You left early," he continued, "before the speeches ended, and I remembered that too, the way I had slipped out. Quietly, not wanting to draw attention, not wanting to stay longer than I felt comfortable, and my chest tightened. That still does not explain anything," I said, but my voice had lost its edge, because part of me already understood where this was going, even if I was not ready to admit it out loud. And he stepped closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to make sure I heard him clearly. "It explains that this did not start tonight," he said, and the weight of that settled into me slowly, like a realization unfolding piece by piece. And I shook my head again, softer this time, not in denial, but in disbelief. "You are telling me you have been what?" "Waiting," I asked, and there was no judgment in his expression, no hesitation in his answer. "Watching," he corrected, and the honesty of it should have pushed me away, should have made me turn and walk the rest of the distance to my apartment without looking back. But it did not, because there was something else in his tone, something that did not feel invasive, did not feel controlling. It felt intentional, and that was what made it harder to ignore, because intention meant choice, and choice meant this was not accidental. And I exhaled slowly, my mind racing, trying to place this in a way that made sense, trying to understand how someone like him could intersect with someone like me in a way that felt so deliberate. And I looked at him again, really looked this time, past the surface, past the control, past the certainty, searching for something that explained why he was standing here instead of anywhere else in the city. And I did not find an answer, not a clear one, but I found something else, something quieter, something that felt like resolve. And that was what made my chest tighten again, because resolve meant he was not leaving, not easily, not without a reason, and I shifted my weight slightly, the distance between us feeling different now, less like a boundary and more like a space I had not decided how to cross. "You said I am not alone," I murmured, more to myself than to him, and he nodded once. "You are not," he said, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just certainty, and I looked down again, my hand still resting where it had been. And for the first time since I left that hospital, since I walked out into a world that felt unchanged while everything inside me had shifted, I felt something else alongside the fear, alongside the uncertainty, something quieter, something steadier, and I did not know what to call it yet. Did not know if I was ready to trust it, but I knew one thing for certain. The version of my life I had been holding on to was already changing, and whether I wanted it to or not, he was now a part of that change. Then tell me the truth, I said, and this time my voice did not shake, not because I was not afraid, but because I was tired of standing in the middle of something I did not fully understand, tired of feeling like I was catching up to a story that had already started without me. And he looked at me for a long second, like he was measuring the weight of that request, like he was deciding how much to give and how much to hold back. And the streetlight above us flickered once, casting shadows that moved across his face, sharp and controlled. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, not softer, just more precise. The truth is not something you hear all at once, he said. And I let out a quiet breath, frustration mixing with the tension already sitting in my chest. That is not an answer, I replied, and he nodded slightly, like he agreed, like he understood exactly why that was not enough. And he took one slow step closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to make sure I could not ignore what he was about to say. You met me that night, he continued, and my brow furrowed, confusion tightening my expression. At the event, he added, and I shook my head immediately, because I would have remembered someone like him. I would have noticed. No, I said, firm, certain, but he did not argue, did not push back. He just held my gaze, steady, unwavering. You did not see me, he corrected, and something about that phrasing made my stomach drop. Slightly, because it implied something I was not ready to unpack, something that made the memory of that night feel different. Heavier, like there were pieces I had not fully processed, and I swallowed, my mind racing through fragments, the crowded room, the music, the brief moments of eye contact with strangers I did not remember, and I shook my head again, slower this time. That still does not explain anything, I said, but my voice had shifted, less certain now, because the ground I was standing on felt less stable with every word he spoke. And he exhaled slowly, like he expected that, like he knew this was not something that would make sense right away. You left early, he repeated, and I nodded slightly, because that part was true, that part one remembered clearly. I followed you, he added, and my breath caught, sharp, immediate, because that was not something I had expected him to say so directly, not something I was ready to hear out loud, and I took a small step back without thinking, my heart starting to race in a way that had nothing to do with fear alone. Why would you do that? I asked, and my voice came out quieter than I intended, more vulnerable, because the question was no longer defensive, it was real, and he did not hesitate this time. Because you were not supposed to be there, he said, and that answer confused me more than anything else, because it did not sound like a compliment, it did not sound like an insult, it sounded like a fact, and I frowned, my mind trying to make sense of it. What does that even mean? I asked, and he tilted his head slightly, like he was considering how to explain something that did not have a simple explanation. It means you stood out, he said. Not because of what you wore, not because of what you said, but because you did not belong to that world, and yet you were in it, unguarded. And my chest tightened at that, because there was something uncomfortably accurate about the way he described it, something that matched exactly how I had felt that night, but had never put into words, and I crossed my arms again, more out of habit than anything else, trying to create distance from the way his words were landing. And that was enough for you to follow me, I said, and he shook his head slightly. No, he replied, that was enough for me to notice you. And there was a difference in the way he said it, a distinction that felt important even if I could not fully explain why. And I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself, trying to keep this conversation from pulling me deeper into something I was not ready to face. And after that, I asked, because I needed to understand the timeline, needed to know how long this had been building without my knowledge, and he looked at me for a moment before answering, like he was deciding how much to reveal. After that, I made sure you were safe, he said, and I blinked, caught off guard again, because that was not what I expected, not the answer I had prepared myself for. Safe from what? I asked, and this time there was a pause, a brief moment where his expression shifted in a way I could not quite read, not fear, not hesitation, something closer to calculation, and then it was gone. replaced by that same steady certainty. From things you do not need to worry about, he said, and I shook my head immediately, frustration rising again. You do not get to decide what I need to worry about, I said, and this time there was no softness in my voice, no hesitation, just a clear boundary, and he held my gaze, unflinching. You are right, he said again, and that repetition should have felt reassuring, but instead it made my chest tighten, because every time he agreed with me, it felt like he was leading me somewhere I had not yet seen, and he took a small step back, giving me space, giving me room to breathe, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the quiet of the street settling around us, the distant sound of a car passing, the faint hum of the city continuing like nothing had changed, and I realized then that I was still here, still standing in front of him, still choosing not to walk away, and that realization felt heavier than anything else, because it meant this was not just happening to me. It meant I was allowing it, and I looked at him. Again, searching for something, anything that would tell me how to move forward, and what I found was the same thing I had been seeing since the beginning, certainty. Not in a way that felt controlling, but in a way that felt grounded, like he knew exactly where he stood in this moment even if I did not. And I swallowed, my voice quieter now, more honest than before. You keep saying I am not alone, I said, and he nodded once. You are not, he repeated, and I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of that statement settle deeper than it had before. Then what are you? I asked, because that was the question that had been building since the beginning, the one I could no longer avoid. And this time, when he answered, there was no pause, no hesitation, just a single, clear response that changed everything. I am the Father, he said, and the world seemed to stop for a second, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for the words to land exactly where they were meant to, and my breath caught, my mind going completely still as I tried to process what he had just said, because this was no longer about observation, no longer about patterns or assumptions. This was something else entirely, something that shifted the entire meaning of everything that had happened tonight, everything that had happened for the past 3 weeks, and I stared at him, unable to look away, because the certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. And for the first time since this conversation began, I realized that the truth I had been avoiding was no longer something I could keep at a distance. No, I said, but it came out like a breath instead of a denial, like my body understood something my mind was still trying to reject, and I shook my head again, stronger this time, forcing the word to carry weight. No, that is not possible. And he did not interrupt me, did not try to correct me immediately. He just stood there, watching, waiting, like he had already anticipated this reaction, like he knew exactly how long it would take for the truth to settle, and I stepped back, my hand pressing harder against my stomach now, not gently anymore, but protectively, like I could shield it from what he had just said, from what it meant. You do not get to say that, I continued, my voice rising slightly, not loud, but sharper, because this was different. This was not something I could let him define for me. You do not get to walk into my life and decide something like that. And he exhaled slowly, not frustrated, not impatient, just steady, like he had expected every word I was saying. And when he spoke, his tone did not change, it did not match my urgency. It remained calm, grounded. I am not deciding, he said. I am stating what is already true. And that made my chest tighten in a way that felt almost painful, because it sounded so certain, so final. And I shook my head again, faster this time, like I could push it away, like I could undo what had already been said. You are wrong, I said, but the words felt weaker now, thinner, like they were losing their shape the longer I held on to them. And he took one step closer, slow, deliberate, not forcing, not closing me in, just enough to make sure I heard him clearly. 3 months ago, he said, and my breath caught again, because I knew exactly what moment he was referring to, even before he finished the sentence. You left that event early, and you did not take a car, he continued. You walked 3 blocks in heels you were not used to wearing, and you stopped twice, once under a streetlight, once outside a closed bookstore. And my heart started racing, because those details were too specific, too precise to be anything but real, and I stared at him, my mind scrambling to catch up, to understand how he could possibly know that. You were there, I said again, but this time it was not a question, it was realization, and he nodded once. I was, he confirmed, and the memory shifted again, the edges of it becoming clearer, sharper, like something I had not noticed before was now impossible to ignore. You spoke to me, he added, and my breath stopped completely for a second, because that was the part one did not remember, the part that did not fit into the version of that night I had been holding on to, and I frowned, confusion flooding in. No, I said, quieter now, because I was not as sure anymore. I would remember that, and his gaze softened slightly, just enough to acknowledge the gap. You would remember parts of it, he corrected, but not all of it, and I felt the ground shift again. That same unsettling sensation that things were not as simple as I had believed, and I searched my memory, pushing past the surface, past the easy parts, looking for something deeper, something I had overlooked, and there was a flicker, brief, incomplete, a voice, a presence, a moment that had not stayed with me the way it should have, and my chest tightened as I realized that maybe I had not been as aware that night as I thought. Maybe I had missed something important, something that mattered now more than it ever did before. Even if that is true, I said slowly, trying to hold on to something solid, something I could still control, that does not prove anything. And he did not argue, did not dismiss it. He just watched me, steady, patient, like he was waiting for me to reach the next conclusion on my own. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, but no less certain. You went to the hospital 3 weeks later, he said, and my breath hitched, because that connection, that timeline, it lined up too perfectly, too clearly, and I felt it then, that sinking realization that had been building piece by piece, that this was not random, not coincidence, not something I could easily explain away, and I shook my head slowly, my voice barely above a whisper now. You cannot know that, I said, but even as I said it, I knew he could, because he already had, because everything he had said so far had been true, and he stepped closer again, just enough to close the space between us without overwhelming it, and his voice dropped, softer now, more focused. I know because I made sure, he said, and I looked up at him sharply, confusion and something deeper colliding in my chest. Made sure what? I asked, and he held my gaze, unwavering. That you were not alone when you walked out of that hospital, he said, and the words hit differently this time, not as a claim, not as control, but as something else, something that felt dangerously close to care, and my throat tightened, because I remembered that moment, the way I had felt standing outside, the way everything had seemed distant and unreal, and the thought that someone had been there, that someone had seen me in that moment when I felt most lost, most uncertain. It shifted something inside me in a way I was not prepared for, and I looked away for a second, trying to process it, trying to keep my thoughts from unraveling completely. Why? I asked again, because that question had not gone away. It had only grown heavier with everything he revealed, and this time his answer came without hesitation, without calculation, just truth. Because you were already carrying my child, he said, and the world seemed to go quiet again, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for the weight of that statement to settle fully, completely, into the space between us, and I stood there, unable to move, unable to look away, because this was no longer something I could deny, no longer something I could push aside as assumption or coincidence. This was something else entirely, something that connected every moment he had described, every detail he had shared, into a truth I was no longer able to ignore, and for the first time since this conversation began, I felt it clearly, not just the fear, not just the uncertainty, but the undeniable shift in my reality, the moment where everything I thought I knew about my life changed, and there was no going back to before. Then say it again, I whispered, because part of me needed to hear it clearly, needed to know if the certainty in his voice would hold when I forced him to repeat it, and he did not hesitate, did not soften it, did not look away. You are carrying my child, he said, and the words landed heavier the second time, not sharper, just more real, like they had settled into place and refused to move. And I felt my breath leave me slowly, like my body was adjusting to something my mind was still trying to catch up with. And I shook my head once, not to deny it anymore, but to clear the noise, to steady myself enough to think. That does not make sense, I said quietly, because that was the only piece I could still hold on to, the only part that felt unresolved, and he watched me carefully, not interrupting, not pushing, just waiting, and I swallowed, forcing the question out. I do not even remember you, I admitted, and saying that out loud made something twist in my chest, because it sounded wrong, because it felt incomplete, like a sentence missing its most important part, and his gaze did not change, did not harden, it just remained steady, grounded. You remember how you felt, he said, and I frowned slightly, confused, because that was not the answer I expected, and I searched my memory again, not for faces or names this time, but for feeling, for something deeper, something less defined, and there it was, faint but present, a sense of calm in the middle of that overwhelming night, a moment where everything had felt quieter, safer, like the chaos of the room had dimmed just enough for me to breathe, and my chest tightened as that realization settled in, because I had dismissed it at the time, had written it off as nothing, as a passing moment that did not matter, and now it felt like the center of everything, and I looked at him again, really looked, trying to match that memory to the man standing in front of me now. And something inside me shifted, not fully, not completely, but enough to make the connection feel possible, and I exhaled slowly. That does not prove anything, I said, but my voice lacked the certainty it had before, because I was no longer arguing against him, I was arguing against the truth I was starting to see, and he nodded slightly, acknowledging that. You are right, he said, and there was no challenge in his tone. No need to win the argument, just a quiet acceptance of where I stood. And that made it harder, not easier, because it removed the conflict I was used to, the push and pull that had defined every difficult conversation I had ever had before, and I shifted my weight again, grounding myself in the present, in the street, in the cool air, anything that felt real and immediate. Even if what you are saying is true, I continued, choosing my words carefully now, because this was no longer about denying it. It was about understanding it. That does not mean you get to be part of this. And that felt like the most important boundary I could draw, the one thing that still belonged entirely to me. And he listened, really listened, not interrupting, not dismissing, and when I finished, he took a slow breath. Before responding, like he respected the weight of what I had said, I do not take what is not given, he said, and there was something in the way he phrased it that made me pause, because it did not sound like a demand, it sounded like a principle, and I studied him for a moment, searching for any sign that he was saying this just to ease the situation, just to keep me from walking away, but I did not find it. All I saw was the same steady certainty, the same grounded presence that had been there from the beginning. And I realized then that whatever this was, whatever role he believed he had, it was not something he intended to force, and that shifted something inside me again, something subtle but important, because it gave me space, gave me control in a way I had not expected, and I looked down at my hand, still resting where it had been, and for the first time since he said it, I let myself feel it fully. Not just the fear, not just the uncertainty, but the reality of it, the fact that there was something more than just me now, something that would exist whether I was ready for it or not, and my throat tightened slightly as I took a slow breath. I was going to handle this on my own, I said, and the words felt different now, less like a plan and more like something I had told myself to feel in control, and he nodded once. I know, he said, and there was no judgment in it, no criticism, just acknowledgement. And that made it harder, not easier, because it meant he understood, because it meant he had seen me even before tonight, seen the way I had been trying to carry everything alone, and I looked back up at him, my voice quieter now, more honest than it had been at any point in this conversation. I still might. I added, because that was the truth, because I was not ready to let go of that completely, and he did not argue, did not push, he just held my gaze, steady, patient. That is your choice, he said, and there it was again, that space, that control, that absence of pressure that made this feel different from anything I had experienced before, and I felt my chest tighten again, not from fear this time, but from something else, something I was not used to, something that felt dangerously close to relief, and I shook my head slightly, more to myself than to him. This is not simple, I said, and he almost smiled, just a fraction, like he understood the understatement. No, he agreed. It is not. And the quiet between us settled again, not heavy this time, not tense, just present, like both of us were standing at the edge of something neither of us could fully define yet. And I realized then that this moment was not about deciding everything, not about figuring out what came next in a single conversation. It was about acknowledging what had already changed, what could no longer be undone. And I took a slow breath, letting that settle, letting the reality of it sit where it needed to. And when I looked at him again, there was less resistance in my gaze, less fear. Not because I trusted him completely, not yet, but because I understood now that this was not something I could face by pretending it was not real. And that, more than anything else, was the beginning of something I had not planned for, something I could not control, but something I could no longer ignore. "You are thinking about running," he said, and the words stopped me before I even realized I had shifted my weight toward the building behind me. Like my body had already made a decision my mind was still catching up to, and I froze for a second, my hand still resting lightly against my stomach, my fingers pressing just enough to remind me why this was not as simple as turning around and walking away. And I looked at him again, a little sharper this time, a little more aware. "I am thinking," I corrected, because that felt more honest, because running implied fear, and I was not afraid of him. Not exactly. I was afraid of what all of this meant, of how much my life had already changed without me fully understanding it. And he nodded slightly, like he accepted the distinction, like he understood that this was not about him alone. "Thinking is good," he said, and there was something almost approving in his tone. Something that made me pause because it did not feel like control. It felt like acknowledgement, and I exhaled slowly, looking past him for a moment, down the empty stretch of sidewalk, the quiet city lights reflecting off windows and parked cars, everything looking so normal, so unchanged, and yet nothing felt the same anymore. And I realized then that standing here, talking to him, was not the hardest part. The hardest part was what came after. What I would do when I walked into my apartment alone, when the silence settled in, and there was no one there to challenge or confirm what had just been said, and my chest tightened slightly at that thought. Because for the first time, the idea of being alone with it did not feel as manageable as it had before, and I shook my head slightly, pulling myself back into the moment, back into the present where he was still standing in front of me, still waiting, still too steady to ignore. "If I decide I do not want you involved," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, because this mattered now in a way it had not before. "What happens then?" And the question hung between us, heavier than anything I had asked so far, because it was not about the past. It was about the future, about control, about boundaries, and he did not answer right away, did not rush to reassure me, did not dismiss the possibility. He just looked at me, steady, thoughtful, like he was giving the question the weight it deserved. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured. "Then I respect your decision," he said. And I blinked, surprised by how simple that sounded, how straightforward it was, because I had expected something else, something more complicated, something that would confirm the control I had been bracing myself for. And I studied his face, searching for any sign that he did not mean it, that there was something hidden behind those words. But all I found was the same certainty, the same grounded presence that had been there from the beginning, and I felt something in my chest loosened slightly, not completely, not enough to trust it fully, but enough to recognize that this was not the kind of situation I had been preparing for. And I swallowed, my voice quieter now, more thoughtful. "And if I do not decide right away," I added, because that felt just as important, because I was not ready to choose anything yet. And he nodded once. "Then you take the time you need," he said, and there was no impatience in it, no urgency, just acceptance. And that shifted something inside me again, something subtle but undeniable, because it meant this was not a demand, not a decision being forced on me. It was an option, and options were something I understood, something I could work with. And I looked down at my hand again, my fingers resting lightly against my stomach, and for a moment I just focused on that, on the reality of it, on the quiet presence that had already changed everything whether I was ready for it or not. And I realized then that this was not just about him, not just about what he wanted or what I allowed. It was about something bigger than both of us, something that existed independently of any decision I made. And my chest tightened at that, not from fear this time, but from the weight of it, from the understanding that this was real in a way I could no longer avoid. And I lifted my gaze back to him, slower this time, more deliberate, You keep saying I am not alone, I said, and he nodded again, steady. You are not, he repeated, and I held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for something, for any sign that this was not as solid as it felt. But it was. It remained, unshaken, and I exhaled softly, the sound almost lost in the quiet of the street. That does not mean I know what to do with that, I admitted, and this time there was no defensiveness in my voice, no resistance, just honesty. And something in his expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge it, to meet me where I was instead of pulling me forward. You do not have to know tonight, he said, and the simplicity of that statement settled into me in a way I did not expect, because it removed the urgency I had been feeling, the pressure to understand everything all at once. And I realized then that maybe this did not have to be solved in a single moment. Maybe it could unfold, piece by piece, at a pace I could manage, and that thought alone made it easier to breathe, easier to stand here without feeling like I was about to be pulled under something I could not control, and I nodded slightly, more to myself than to him, acknowledging that, accepting it in a small, quiet way, and the silence that followed felt different now, not tense, not uncertain, just open, like there was space for whatever came next without forcing it into shape too quickly. And after a moment, he stepped back slightly, creating a little more distance between us, not retreating, just giving me room. And that gesture, simple as it was, confirmed something I had been starting to understand, that he was not here to trap me in this moment. He was here to make sure I did not face it alone. And that realization settled deeper than anything else he had said so far, because it was not just words, it was action, it was presence. It was something I could feel even in the quiet space between us, and I stood there for a second longer, taking it in, letting it settle, and then I glanced back toward my building, toward the door I had almost walked through before he stepped out of that car, and I realized that the next step was still mine to take, that nothing about this had taken that away from me, and that, more than anything else, was what made this feel possible, even if I did not fully understand it yet. Go inside, he said, and it was the first time his voice carried something different, not control, not insistence, but a quiet finality, like he was marking the end of this moment without forcing it to continue. And I stood there for a second longer, the words settling over me as I looked at the door, just a few steps away, the familiar entrance that had always meant safety, routine, control. And yet tonight it felt different, like stepping through it would not reset anything, would not erase what had just been said, would not return me to the version of my life I had been holding on to. And I exhaled slowly, nodding once, not because he told me to, but because I knew he was right, because there was nothing more to say right now that would change anything. And I turned, my steps measured as I walked toward the building, the sound of my shoes against the pavement louder than it should have been in the quiet of the night, and I felt it, that awareness behind me, not heavy, not intrusive, just present, like he was still there, still watching, not to control, but to make sure I got inside safely. And that realization lingered with me in a way I did not expect, because it was not something I had ever experienced before, not like this, not without expectation attached to it. And I reached the door, my hand pausing on the handle for a second as I glanced back over my shoulder, and he had not moved, still standing where I left him, the streetlight casting a steady glow over his figure, his posture unchanged, his presence as solid as it had been from the beginning. And our eyes met again for a brief moment, and something passed between us that did not need words, something that felt like acknowledgement, like understanding. And then I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the quiet hum of the building wrapping around me, familiar and grounding in a way that almost felt unreal after everything that had just happened. And I let the door close behind me, the soft click echoing slightly in the empty hallway. And for a moment I just stood there, my back against the door, my eyes closed as I tried to steady my breathing, tried to let everything settle into something I could process. And it did not right away, because my mind was still racing, still replaying every word, every detail, every moment that had led to this. And my hand moved again, slower this time, resting gently against my stomach, not out of instinct anymore, but out of awareness, out of acknowledgement. And I stayed like that for a second longer before pushing myself away from the door and walking down the hallway toward my apartment, each step feeling heavier than usual, not physically, but in a way that came from everything I was carrying now, everything that had shifted in a single night. And when I reached my door, I unlocked it automatically, stepping inside without thinking, the familiar space greeting me with the same quiet stillness it always had, the soft glow of the lamp I had left on earlier casting warm light across the room, and I closed the door behind me, the lock clicking into place, and for the first time since I left the restaurant, I was alone, completely alone, and the silence hit differently now, not comforting, not neutral, but full, like it was holding everything I had been avoiding, everything I could no longer push aside, and I stood there in the middle of my apartment, my purse still on my shoulder, my jacket still on, my mind struggling to catch up to the reality of what had just happened, and I moved slowly, setting my things down on the small table by the door, my movements deliberate, controlled, like I was trying to keep everything from unraveling all at once, and I walked into the kitchen, pouring a glass of water without really thinking about it, just needing something to ground me, something to hold on to, and I took a small sip, the coolness sharp against my throat, anchoring me just enough to breathe a little easier, and I leaned against the counter, my eyes drifting around the room, taking in the details I had always known, the couch, the books stacked neatly on the shelf, the framed photo on the wall, everything exactly where it had been before, and yet it all felt different, like I was looking at it from the outside, like this version of my life no longer fit as comfortably as it once had, and I exhaled slowly, setting the glass down as my hand moved again, resting against my stomach. And this time I did not pull it away, I did not pretend it was not there, I just let it stay, letting the reality of it settle in fully, completely, and my mind drifted back to his words, the certainty in them, the way he had said it without hesitation, without doubt, and I shook my head slightly, not to deny it anymore, but to process it, to let it take shape in a way that made sense, and I pushed myself off the counter, walking slowly into the living room, lowering myself onto the couch as I stared at nothing in particular, my thoughts moving in slow, uneven waves, and I reached into my pocket, pulling out the card he had given me earlier, turning it over between my fingers as I looked at the name again, Adrian Russo, and something about seeing it here, in my space, made everything feel more real, more immediate, like this was no longer just a conversation on a quiet street. It was something that had followed me home, something that now existed inside the same walls I had always relied on to keep everything separate, and I held the card for a moment longer before setting it down on the table in front of me, my fingers lingering on the edge of it, like I was not quite ready to let go, and I leaned back against the couch, closing my eyes for a second as I let out a slow breath. And for the first time since this night began, I allowed myself to feel it fully, not just the confusion, not just the uncertainty, but the undeniable shift in my life, the moment where everything changed, and as I sat there in the quiet, one thought settled deeper than the rest, steady, unshakable, and impossible to ignore. He was not going anywhere, and neither was the truth. The silence did not stay quiet for long, because once my mind started moving again, it did not stop. It filled every corner of the room, every second of stillness, every breath I tried to steady, and I leaned forward slightly, my elbows resting on my knees as I stared at the card on the table, like it might change if I looked at it long enough, like the name would fade, like the number would disappear, like this entire night would undo itself if I just waited, but it did not. It stayed exactly the same, solid, real, unshaken, and I let out a slow breath, reaching for it again without thinking, my fingers brushing over the surface before I picked it up, holding it between my thumb and index finger like it was something fragile, something that required care even though it was just paper, and I turned it over again, reading the name once more, Adrian Russo, letting it settle into me in a way it had not before, because now it was not just a name tied to a moment, it was tied to something much bigger, something I could not ignore, and I leaned back again, my head resting against the couch as I closed my eyes for a second, trying to organize my thoughts into something that made sense. Something I could follow, but every path led back to the same place, to the same realization, to the same truth that had been building all night, and my hand moved again, slower this time, more deliberate, resting against my stomach as I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, the soft light casting faint shadows that shifted slightly as I breathed, and I let myself feel it, not just the weight of the situation, but the presence of it, the quiet, steady reality that was now a part of me, whether I was ready or not. And I swallowed, my throat tight as I pushed myself up from the couch, pacing slowly across the room, my steps measured, controlled, like movement alone might help me think more clearly, and I stopped near the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look out onto the street below, and my breath caught slightly when I saw it. The same black car still parked where it had been before, not hidden, not moved, just there, and I stared at it for a second longer. Then I meant to, my heart beating just a little faster as the realization settled in. He had not left, not completely, not yet, and I let the curtain fall back into place, turning away as I pressed my lips together, trying to process what that meant, because part of me expected it, part of me was not surprised, but another part of me felt something else entirely, something that was harder to define, something that was not fear, not discomfort, but something closer to reassurance, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because it was not something I was used to feeling in situations like this, and I walked back toward the couch, slower this time, my thoughts shifting again, trying to make sense of the fact that he was still out there, still present, still choosing not to walk away even after everything I had said, everything I had questioned, and I sat down again, the card still in my hand, my fingers tightening around it slightly as I stared at it once more, and I realized then that this was no longer just about what he knew or what he claimed. It was about what I was going to do with that knowledge, with that presence, with that reality that was now sitting in front of me, and I exhaled slowly, my mind moving through the possibilities, through the choices I still had. And for the first time since this night began, I allowed myself to consider something I had been avoiding, not just whether he was right, not just whether this was real, but whether I was willing to face it with someone else involved. And that thought lingered, heavier than the others, because it meant letting go of the control I had been holding on to, the independence I had built my life around, the certainty that I could handle everything on my own. And I shook my head slightly, not rejecting it, but acknowledging how difficult that would be, and I leaned forward again, placing the card carefully on the table in front of me, my fingers lingering on it for a moment before pulling away, and I sat back, my gaze fixed on it as I let the silence settle again, not empty this time, not overwhelming, just present, like it was waiting for me to decide what came next, and I stayed there for a while, not moving, not speaking, just thinking, letting everything shift into place slowly, piece by piece, until the weight of it felt less chaotic, less overwhelming, and more defined. And I realized then that this was not something I could solve in one night, not something I could understand completely before making a decision, but it was something I could acknowledge, something I could choose to face one step at a time. And I took a slow breath, my hand moving once more to rest gently against my stomach, and this time the gesture felt different, not instinctive, not protective in the same way, but intentional, like I was finally accepting what it meant, what it carried, what it would require from me moving forward. And I closed my eyes for a second, letting that settle fully, and when I opened them again, my gaze shifted back to the card, to the name, to the number, and I knew then that ignoring it was no longer an option, not because of him, not because of what he had said, but because of what this meant for me, for what came next. And I reached for my phone slowly, my fingers hovering over it for a second before picking it up, the screen lighting up in my hand as I stared at it, my heart beating just a little faster as I realized what I was about to do. Not because I had decided everything, not because I had all the answers, but because I was ready to take the next step, whatever that meant. And I glanced once more toward the window, toward the street where I knew he was still waiting, and then back to the phone in my hand. And for the first time since this night began, my next move felt like it belonged entirely to me. I did not press call right away, my thumb hovering just above the screen as if that small distance could hold everything in place a little longer, like the moment would stay contained if I did not close that gap. And I stared at the number, memorizing it without meaning to, each digit settling into my mind as something more than just contact information, something tied to a decision I was not fully ready to define. And I exhaled slowly, lowering the phone slightly as I leaned back against the couch again, my other hand resting against my stomach in a way that felt steadier now, more grounded. And I realized that this was not hesitation, not exactly. It was awareness, the understanding that once I made this call, once I crossed that line, there would be no pretending this was temporary, No stepping back into the version of my life that did not include him. And that thought lingered for a second before something else replaced it. Something quieter but stronger, the memory of him. Standing outside. The way he had not left, the way he had not pressured me, had not tried to follow me inside, had simply remained, present without forcing his way into my space. And I swallowed, my chest tightening slightly as that detail settled deeper than the rest, because it meant something I could not ignore, and I lifted the phone again, my thumb finally pressing against the screen, the call initiating with a soft vibration that felt louder than it should have in the silence of the room, and I brought it to my ear, my breath catching slightly as I listened to the faint ringing on the other end, each second stretching just a little longer than expected, and for a moment I wondered if he would not answer, if I had waited too long, if this was already something I had missed. But then the line connected, and his voice came through, low, steady, immediate. I was wondering how long it would take, and something in my chest shifted at that. Not surprise, not exactly, but recognition, like he had been expecting this, like he had known I would call even when I was not sure myself. And I let out a quiet breath, steadying myself before speaking. I have not decided anything, I said, because that felt important to establish, because I needed him to understand that this was not agreement, not acceptance, just a step. And there was a brief pause on the other end before he responded. I know, he said simply, and the lack of pressure in that answer made it easier to breathe, easier to continue. And I glanced toward the window again, my gaze lingering for a second as I imagined him still out there, still waiting, still as steady as he had been before, and I shifted slightly on the couch, grounding myself in the present before speaking again. But I need to understand what this means, I added, my voice quieter now, more honest, because this was no longer about denying anything. It was about facing it. And he did not hesitate, did not deflect, his voice coming through clear and certain. It means you do not have to carry this alone, he said. And I closed my eyes for a second, letting the words settle, letting them sink into the part of me that had been resisting them all night. And I shook my head slightly, even though he could not see it. That is not enough, I said softly, because it was not, because this was bigger than that, more complicated than a single reassurance. And there was another brief pause before he responded, not defensive, not frustrated, just thoughtful. Then ask what you need to know, he said. And I opened my eyes again, staring at the ceiling as I considered that, because there were too many questions, too many unknowns, and I did not know where to start. And my hand moved slightly against my stomach, grounding me again, reminding me what mattered most in this moment. And I took a slow breath before speaking. If you are right, I said, carefully, choosing each word with intention. Then what happens next? And the question felt heavier than anything I had asked before, because it was not about the past anymore. It was about the future, about decisions that would shape everything moving forward. And on the other end of the line, he did not answer immediately. And I could almost picture him, the way he would pause, the way he would consider before speaking, not out of uncertainty, but out of precision. And when he did respond, his voice was steady, grounded. That depends on you, he said, and I frowned slightly, my grip tightening on the phone. That is not an answer, I said, echoing my earlier frustration, but there was less edge in it now, more expectation, and he exhaled softly, the sound faint but present through the line. It is the only honest one, he replied, and I let that sit for a second, letting it settle into the quiet space between us, because part of me understood what he meant, even if it was not the clarity I was looking for, and I shifted again, sitting up a little straighter as I focused on the conversation, on the moment. I am not asking you to decide for me, I said. I am asking what you would do. And there was a slight change in the silence that followed, not hesitation, not uncertainty, just a shift in focus, like he understood exactly what I was asking now. And when he spoke again, his voice was just as steady as before, but there was something deeper in it, something more personal. I would make sure you are safe, he said. I would make sure you have everything you need, and I would be there whether you wanted me close or at a distance. And I felt my chest tighten at that, because it was not dramatic, not overwhelming. It was simple, direct, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to question, and I swallowed, my voice quieter now, almost a whisper. And if I choose to do this on my own, I asked, and there was no pause this time, No hesitation at all. Then I will still make sure you are safe, he said. And something about that answer settled into me in a way nothing else had, because it removed the condition, removed the expectation, and left only the presence, the intention that had been there from the beginning. And I closed my eyes again, letting that sink in, letting it take shape alongside everything else I had been processing. And for the first time since this night began, the path forward did not feel like a single decision. It felt like a series of choices, steps I could take at my own pace. And I took a slow breath, steadying myself before speaking again. Then we start there, I said, and the words felt right as soon as they left my mouth, not final, not absolute, but grounded. And there was a brief pause on the other end before he responded, his voice quieter now, but no less certain. We start there, he agreed. And as the line went quiet again, I realized that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something I had not planned for, something I could not fully control, but something I was finally ready to face, one step at a time. The line stayed quiet for a second after his last words, not empty, not disconnected, just settled, like something had been placed between us that did not need to be repeated to exist. And I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening slightly around the phone as I leaned back into the couch, my eyes drifting toward the ceiling again, tracing the faint lines in the paint as I let everything settle into place. And for the first time since this night began, the silence did not feel overwhelming. It felt steady, like something had shifted into alignment even if I could not fully explain it yet. And I swallowed, my voice softer now, more grounded. You are still outside, I said, not as a question, but as an observation, and there was a brief pause on the other end before he answered, yes. And the simplicity of that response made something in my chest tighten, not from uncertainty, but from the quiet consistency of it. The way he did not pretend otherwise, did not try to make it seem like anything less than what it was, and I glanced toward the window again, even though I could not see him from where I sat. And I shifted slightly, sitting up straighter. You do not have to stay there, I said, because that felt like something I needed to acknowledge, because this was not something I had asked for, and he responded just as calmly, I know. And there it was again, that absence of pressure, that space he kept giving me even while staying present. And I let out a quiet breath, my hand moving again to rest against my stomach, slower now, more intentional. And I realized then that this moment was different from everything that came before it, because this was not about proving anything, not about convincing me, it was about consistency, about showing up in a way that did not demand anything in return. And that realization settled deeper than I expected, because it was not something I was used to, not something I had built my life around. And I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees as I stared at the floor for a second, grounding myself before speaking again. You said we start there, I murmured, more to myself than to him. And he did not interrupt, did not rush to fill the space. He just listened, and I nodded slightly. The movement small but deliberate. Then the first thing I need is clarity, I said, my voice steady now, because this was something I could hold on to, something I could define, and there was no hesitation in his response. Then we get it, he said, and I closed my eyes for a second, letting that settle, letting the simplicity of it take shape, and I continued. I need to see this through properly, I added, my hand pressing lightly against my stomach again. Doctor appointments, real answers, not just assumptions. And there was a brief pause before he responded, not because he was uncertain, but because he was considering the weight of what I had said. You will have all of that, he said, and there was something in his tone that made it clear this was not a promise he would forget, not something he would treat lightly. And I exhaled slowly, feeling something in my chest loosen just a little more, not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize that this was becoming something I could navigate, something I could approach step by step. And I shifted again, leaning back into the couch as I let my head rest against it, my gaze drifting toward the table where his card still lay. And I realized that this small piece of paper had become something else entirely, something that connected two parts of my life that had never intersected before. And I let out a quiet breath, my voice softer now, but still steady. And boundaries, I added, because that mattered just as much, because I needed to know where I stood, where this would not cross into something I could not control. And he did not hesitate. You set them, he said, and I felt a slight shift at that, something that felt like respect, like acknowledgement of my position in this, and I nodded slowly, even though he could not see it. Then you do not show up unannounced, I said, choosing my words carefully. You do not follow me unless I ask, and you do not decide anything without me. And there was a brief silence after that, not tense, not uncertain, just thoughtful, and then he responded, his voice just as steady as before, agreed. And the simplicity of that answer made something settle in me in a way I had not expected, because it meant this was not a negotiation, not a power struggle. It was a structure, something we could both understand, and I closed my eyes again for a second, letting that take shape, letting it settle into something real. And when I opened them, I felt different, not completely changed, not suddenly certain, but more grounded than I had been at any point tonight, and I took a slow breath, my hand resting lightly where it had been all evening, and for the first time, it did not feel like a reaction. It felt like acceptance, and I spoke again, quieter now, but clearer than before. Then that is where we begin. And there was no hesitation in his response, no shift in his tone, just that same steady certainty that had been there from the start. That is where we begin, he said, and the line fell quiet again. But this time it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a pause, like the space between steps rather than the end of the path, and I lowered the phone. Slowly, pulling it away from my ear as I stared at it for a second, letting the moment settle fully before ending the call, and when I finally did, when the screen went dark, and the silence returned completely, it felt different, not empty, not overwhelming, just open, like something had shifted into place, and I sat there for a moment longer, my gaze drifting back to the card on the table, to the space around me, to the quiet of the apartment that no longer felt quite the same, and I realized then that this was not about losing control, it was about redefining it, about choosing how to move forward instead of pretending I could stand still, and I leaned back against the couch, my hand resting gently against my stomach as I let out a slow, steady breath. And for the first time since everything began, I was not trying to figure out how to undo it. I was deciding how to face it. And somewhere beyond the walls of this apartment, under the same quiet streetlight, he was still there, not as a shadow I needed to escape, but as a presence I had chosen to acknowledge. And that choice, more than anything else, was where everything truly began.